Former Senator McCarthy says he is still exploring a bid for the presidency. According to his campaign staff, a decision is expected by November. This past Monday, October 14th, he addressed law school students at Harvard University. The former Minnesota senator discussed his own political plans and also gave an historical perspective on the presidency.
When I accepted the invitation to speak here, I hadn't really given very much serious thought to the presidency, so I'll try to be objective and talk about the presidency 1992. The introduction was a little bit off key, and that I really haven't changed my position on the presidency or on the candidacy. I just have been entering upon it rather gradually. I found that I should have indicated I was going to run sort of like Cuomo and then say I'm not 6 or 7 times, because every time Cuomo says he's not running, he gets a headline. He's really made more exits than entrances. I've proceeded somewhat differently. I think I first said I would not say I wouldn't run, and then I said I was thinking about running, and then I acknowledged that I was running, and someone said, well, when are you going to declare? And if you're careful, I might subtly do it here tonight. And you could say I was there not when he announced, but when he declared. In any case, I mean to take, I don't know, it's not taking advantage of you, but to do a short history of the presidency. In the times that I was in the House and Senate, which goes back to 1948, and I think the final position I'll take is we finally, at least for now, have the closest thing to a no-fault presidency that we've ever had. It may be part of the general trend of things to a kind of no-fault society, whether it's no-fault savings and loans, or no-fault banking, or no-fault automobile insurance. Is this working all right? You hear? One of the promises I made in '68 was we might not put anyone on the moon, but we'd have a public address system that worked everywhere in America. And I find that that's an unmet need of the country. I may have to promise it again. I started service in the Congress with Harry Truman in the election following after the election of 1948, and looking back and reflecting on the successive presidencies, I have concluded that Harry Truman was really the last constitutional president on 2 counts. He knew when he was president, and he knew when he was Harry Truman, and he had a basic respect and regard for the other institutions of government, for the Constitution, and what it prescribed the Senate should be, and what the House of Representatives should be, and how the Supreme Court and the courts generally should be treated. Progressively was the best example of that, I suppose, was the proposition made to him with reference to the war in Korea, that he should send up a resolution and get the Congress to approve it on the presumption that once they had approved a resolution, they could not criticize what happened following that. And he said he wouldn't send it up, that he was acting as he should be as president, and that he was not going to try to hamper or hinder the Senate, particularly in its constitutional role of criticizing if conditions justified that, or even if they didn't justify it, he would allow them freedom to criticize. Or a second example, during that same war, there was trouble with the steel industry. They were not adequately supplying steel, and Truman issued an executive order to take them over, to force them to provide steel for the war effort. The Supreme Court held that what he had done was not constitutional, and he immediately withdrew and followed other procedures. Whereas subsequent presidents, having similar trouble with the steel industry, used other approaches. In the Kennedy administration, so far as we can tell, it was the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service that talked to the presidents of the steel companies and suggested that maybe they ought to conform rather than have the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service looking at them. And Johnson had similar trouble, and he simply said to the president of the steel companies, "Why don't you come to Washington and talk to me in the White House? If you fix prices in the White House, it's all right. If you fix them in Pittsburgh, it's a violation of the law." And they chose to confer. Actually, presidents of major corporations really like to be considered outside the law in any case. He was a little bit like King John inviting the nobles in, and they agreed to what he wanted in the case of Johnson and went on from that. In any case, this pretty much ended with Harry Truman, who was succeeded by Eisenhower. And the Eisenhower presidency was a sort of non-presidency. He didn't abuse the powers of the office, he just didn't use them, which is almost as serious a matter as abusing them. Delegating authority to cabinet members, delegating authority to John Foster Dulles, and delegating authority to Allen Dulles and the CIA, and proceeding pretty much in that way. The Democrats tried to get Eisenhower to run in '48, and I guess again in '52, and he chose to be the Republican candidate. And it was said that the Democrats wanted him to do more if he were president than the Republicans did. And so he took the office with a paraphrase of Sherman's famous words, "If nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve." That Eisenhower said, "If nominated, I will run, but if elected, I will not serve." And that was pretty much the mark of his administration. Although he took some responsibility for the U-2 flight, he said he should have known about it before it happened, which was about as far as he went. And then his farewell address, which you may recall at least one phrase or line or two from it, he warned us of the existence of the military-industrial complex. But he didn't say that it was built up while he was president, and that he should have been on guard against it because of almost anyone that you might think of as president. He should have been alerted to the potential for that kind of buildup. In any case, he left us with that message at the end, acknowledging that he had not really been as attentive to national affairs as he should have been. Well, the Eisenhower administration was followed by the Kennedy administration, and there were two things that happened there. Well, one really was the extreme personalization of the office, something quite different from what we'd had. But there was not a denial of responsibility. John Kennedy accepted that the Bay of Pigs was his decision, and he could have made excuses for it because it had actually been planned by the Eisenhower administration, and the pressure was there to sort of carry out the plans. One cynic observed that the reason it didn't go well was the plans were prepared for Eisenhower, who always worked from a digest, and that the Kennedy administration were speed readers. And if you speed read a digest, well, you're likely to come up a little on the short side and leave out a few considerations. But in any case, there was the personalization on the one hand and the acceptance of responsibility on the other. And this was sort of a transition administration with the move towards personalization and the move away really from responsibility and from concern really for the constitutional character and traditional character of the office, which I thought was most clearly manifest in the Truman administration. President Johnson proceeded to personalize the office even more clearly than Kennedy had, and it was manifest principally, I think, in Well, the simple manifestation was if you were watching Johnson and watching the language, or if you had been watching the language of presidents, particularly watched his, he began to use the possessive pronoun my about almost everything. My cabinet and my party and my vice president, which was the proper use of the pronoun in his case. And the example reported he was on an air base and he ordered an airman to move a helicopter, and the airman said, "I can't do it without my commanding officer's orders," and Johnson reportedly said, "They're my helicopters," suggesting that his possessiveness carried down to that very point. On the side of responsibility, of course, this was the movement into Vietnam primarily that had to be examined. Johnson used almost every defense, some of which had been available to Kennedy. One was the ideological thing of confrontation with communists, which had justified Kennedy sending in the special forces. Johnson used the device of the resolution to cover any possible criticism, the Tonkin Gulf resolution, in contrast with Harry Truman, who said no resolution. And Johnson added another protection and defense against taking responsibility, which was, I suppose, best called the Johnson Doctrine. It's rather curious that the last 5 or 6 presidents have all had doctrines. Something that started with Monroe, although Monroe didn't know he had a doctrine. It was only later that people said there is a Monroe Doctrine. But presidents after Truman really had recourse to doctrines, and Johnson's doctrine is properly called that of presidential succession. And it suggests that any succeeding president can do or continue what his predecessor had done and not have to answer for it. And Johnson said, "I'm only doing what 3 presidents before me were interested in and advanced." Truman had supported the French in Vietnam, and Eisenhower had sent in the special forces, advisors, 900 of them, and Kennedy had sent in 1,900 special forces. And Johnson said, "I'm only continuing. It's merely a quantitative difference. There's not a particular decision made here. It's a kind of continuum." And that doctrine was advanced another step by Nixon, who personalized the office even more intimately than Johnson had. Johnson at least used the possessive pronoun my, which relates to himself, to I. Nixon had a kind of incarnational concept of the office with a projection into I guess, a mystical body. He used the plural, we, about most things. Even Watergate, he said that he was responsible, but we were to blame. And you wondered who it was. If he'd said we were responsible, but he was to blame, you would have had a kind of personalization of responsibility. But he didn't say that. But he used we rather generally when he talked about problems of the country, especially difficulties. And I didn't really want to be included in the we and try to kind of keep it away. And my best defense was always, or still is, I guess, because you find a we occasionally in George Bush's language. Mark Twain said that no one should use the collective we unless he was the King of England, there was a king at that time, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or someone with a tapeworm. And so the Nixon claim was one that had to be seriously challenged. Nixon said, continuing the Johnson doctrine, that he was only continuing what 4 presidents before him had been interested in. And you could make a projection saying, war in Vietnam, Southeastern Asia is a part of the national heritage. And the next president could say, I'm doing what 5 did, and the next one could say, I'm doing what 6 did, with no allowance for any kind of intervention in historical context allowed. Nixon carried the depersonalization a little bit farther, and a kind of unconstitutionality. He conducted, well, you really can't conduct it. He introduced into American history the idea of the incursion. the incursion into Cambodia, which was, I think, illegal and unconstitutional, but it's very hard to challenge anyone who takes responsibility for it. He doesn't even take responsibility. In incursion, when he first used it, I said, well, that's strange. I've never run across that word used in American history or even in any other national history. You say, where did it come from? What's the implication of it? And as I analyzed it, I realized there's no verb for incursion. You can't incurse. It's a kind of happening. You can invade, and you're responsible for the action. An incursion is an occurrence. And you say, did you do the incursion? Incursion, it just happened. It's sort of existential. And nobody's responsible for it. It was just out there all alone, a kind of absolute experience. And Nixon said, incursion, yes, but not I, you know, it's one of those things. And I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but it was indicative, I think, of sort of the approach to the matter of Vietnam, first of all, but particularly of the Nixon conduct of it. And then, of course, the rather clear demonstration of his lack of a sense of what the presidency was, constitutional or otherwise, with the whole Watergate thing, when he sort of set himself above the law and outside the Constitution as the almost ultimate demonstration of his disrespect for the Constitution and traditions of the presidency. Well, the Carter administration was sort of out of any kind of context. It's hard to label it as either personalist or anti-constitutional. It was sort of vague and highly moral. But in the Reagan administration, you get back to this same sort of question, a progressive move towards a personalization of the presidency, even though the constitutional issue was not so clear. And Reagan really did not exist in any context. Some Frenchman said of another one in politics, and I guess I applied it to Reagan first, but he said his problem is that he imagines the past and he remembers the future. And that's sort of where Ronald lived. He would say things like, we must recapture our destiny, which puts you before and after. And the result of that was that he lived in a kind of continuous now. There was no before or after. The sun was straight overhead. And you know, calendars had no days. There was no counting. And it was not all bad, excepting that there comes a time when you have to move out of that. And I think that the good thing that came out of it was probably the decision in Iceland when he agreed that at that particular moment, now, in Iceland, we didn't need as many nuclear weapons as we had. Maybe we did in the past, he might say, or we might need them in the future, but now, right now, we have more than we need, so why don't we start cutting back now, and then we'll see what we do about it tomorrow. Someone said that, well, I did too, and I agreed with him. I said that I'd never known what zero-based thinking was until the decision was made in Iceland by Ronald Reagan. This is sort of absolute zero in an absolute now time. It was a strange kind of personalization. We moved on from that to George Bush, in which I think you've really moved away even from the kind of limited person that you had involved in Ronald Reagan, one without a before or after, which is an unusual condition. And it's hard to place Bush in terms of the personalization in that in his case, there's no now. It's always before or after, or I'm with you or I'm against you, or I'm above or I'm below. It isn't right here now where you make a decision. And it's moved him to, I think, to incarnate almost the full measure of the no-fault presidency. If you talk about the condition of the budget, he said, well, that's the Democrats' fault. It's not my fault. If you proceed to talk about the whole development in the Middle East, he said, well, it was really Saddam shouldn't have thought that we were really not opposed to his moving into Kuwait. And the explanation given by Alice Glaspie was that the administration and the State Department didn't realize that Saddam was as dumb as he was. So really the original mistake was because Saddam was dumb, not because the administration was smart, or not because Bush understood this. And you say this is a new factor in foreign policy. If you're analyzing State Department policy, you first have to make a decision as to how stupid the opposite number is. And in this case, it was never determined whether the State Department people were not smart enough to know how stupid Saddam was, or whether their intelligence reaches down only to a certain level, below which they don't have any understanding, and that Saddam was just below the level at which they could understand his stupidity. He wasn't within the range of their judgment. And I suppose you could say the same thing about Noriega. But as he proceeded to the Gulf War, he said things like, I will do what the military tell me to do. So if it goes wrong, why, it's their fault, not mine, suggesting that the President and others during Vietnam hadn't done what the military suggested they do. And then he said, I have the UN supporting me, so this reduces his responsibility, and the coalition allies are supporting me. And then as it proceeded, as they pursued the Iraqis in retreat, he said they were justified in doing it under the terms of the Geneva Convention. So at each point, there was a move to say, I'm not responsible. There's someone out there or some institution or some rule that allows me to proceed without taking responsibility. After it worked out reasonably successful, limited success, he said, well, I didn't really do what General Powell told me to do. I went in before he wanted to, and I didn't go as far as Schwarzkopf did. But the progression, or the end of the action in the war, sort of stopped when you reached a point where Bush would have had to make a decision. And beyond that point, why it sort of stalled, and we had no policy really for working out the any post-war settlement. And the final, you kind of look for sort of an absolute explanation, if you can, for actions of this kind. And Peggy Noonan, in her book about Reagan, in one of the last chapters, reports how she did some writing for Bush early in his campaign. And when she submitted her first text, the head speechwriter said, we can't use your material because George doesn't like to say I. And you've got to get the personal pronoun I out of the text if you want him to use it. And he allowed two ways. One, you could say we if it was right, or he actually liked to have just predicates without a subject. So you could say, started a war, you know, got up this morning, moved to Texas. And she said that they speculated on whether when he took the oath of office he would simply say, do solemnly swear. And you would not know whether it was a question or a suggestion or an action indicative of an action he had taken. So in effect you had moved to almost to the, and I think this happens if you over-personalize the presidency, then you try to move away from it until you sort of completely depersonalize it. And at the same time as this was happening, especially in the Bush administration, there was almost in every area of action a disrespect or disregard for the Constitution. And this may be, it may be the mark of future presidencies unless something is done about it. But it showed disdain or disrespect for the Constitution fundamentally. If he didn't, he would not have proposed things like a constitutional amendment dealing with abortion, for example, or to amend the Constitution to put prayer in public schools. President sensitive to the Constitution would say, well, this is dangerous material. It's in the range of some of the basic prejudices that affect our society. And on the record, it hasn't worked. I mean, the Founding Fathers didn't expect the Constitution to try to lay down moral imperatives. And the worst example, of course, was the attempt with prohibition. He shows disrespect for the separation of powers. The excessive use of the veto, for example, is a presidential power which should be used very carefully, and to use it as he does is to not just to show disregard or disrespect for the separation of powers, which is a delicate balance, but to be willing to exploit it. And the Founding Fathers, in the Federalist Paper and other discussions, were worried about a number of things, but two in particular which were juxtaposed. One was the veto power, the abusive use of it by the President against majority rule, and the other was the power to impeach the President. And they were afraid that it might develop that you would impeach presidents unnecessarily or for political reasons. And they were concerned also that the veto power might be used, it might be abused. And they saw it as impeachment versus the veto, which never quite developed because impeachment never became very popular, although the case against Andrew Johnson was pretty slight. But it has had this effect. The presidents who use the veto power excessively usually encourage Congress to be irresponsible in what they send up to the President. And the clearest example of that, there are a number, but this is the clearest one, I think, was in 1972. Nixon was into vetoing things and playing politics with constitutional powers and the separation of powers. And he proposed an increase in Social Security of 5%. And said he would veto anything above that, sort of the way Bush now says, if you don't do what I want, I'll veto whatever you do. And so the Democrats, not quite trusting Richard Nixon, said if we go to 10%, he'll probably sign and take credit for it. So to head him off, they raised Social Security roughly 20%, figuring that Nixon's integrity, having said he would veto anything over 5%, would probably show up in a veto of 20%. And they could then pass one for 10% and say, look, we wanted to give you 20, but Nixon vetoed it, so we gave you 10. But not Richard Nixon. He signed it. And in the Social Security checks that came out at the end of October of '72, just before the election, there was an insert which said, dear retiree, I hope you notice that your check is 20% higher than it was last week or last month. And I want you to know I signed the bill, Richard Nixon. Well, clearly a case in which excessive use of the veto and threat of it had challenged Congress to be, or moved them to be irresponsible. Well, the same thing is manifest in the Bush administration, a willingness to impinge upon the separation of powers and to put it in danger. And well, I suppose that even beyond that, the most serious faulty of this administration, as I see it, is a willingness, a disposition, almost a policy of exploiting the most critical areas in which there is prejudice or danger of prejudice becoming manifest in action in this country. The nomination of Thomas, for example, was certain to set not just liberals and conservatives against each other, which is traditional, but actually setting blacks against blacks, which is a new kind of division in the country, at least one that hasn't been a serious matter. His action in reference to the quotas had a kind of a doubly disturbing effect. One was whites against blacks, which is a prejudice we have to be worried about, but it also set up division among the working people. If you have 8 million unemployed and you can then talk about a quota system which might have effect upon 100,000 or 200,000 people, and practically all of those who are unemployed and those who think they're in danger of it will say, it's not the 800 million unemployed that's our problem, it's the threat of affirmative action which may have taken my job or which might take my job. And to inject that into a situation which is at best a very difficult one, the action in the way of affirmative action programs, is that anyone who deals with it or looks at it knows is one that is very delicate. And the third prejudicial area which he stirred up, as I see it, was in his request on Congress not to approve the loan to Israel. And he said, well, we're going to approve it later. We don't want to approve it now because the Arabs will react and so on, kind of nonsense. But the effect of it was to open the way to positive manifestation of either anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli program. And in the papers today report a study which said that I think 75% of the people approve holding up the loan, but that 48% of the people moved by this said, whoever asked the question, 48% I think it was, said they don't want to make any kind of loans or give any kind of aid to Israel. Well, anyone who's reasonably sensitive to our times and circumstances, especially the President of the United States, should be, I would say, most careful about these three prejudicial areas, race and religion and anti-Semitism. Yet for whatever reason or cause, lack of sensitivity or lack of understanding or some kind of political advantage, he has not hesitated to intrude in these critical areas. And finally, I fault him as a president. Any president, I think they ought to be most careful of the English language, if nothing else, to keep the language reasonably clean. And recent presidents have abused the language. Eisenhower spoke a kind of strange code, but you could read it if you sort of reflected on it and thought it over, and you didn't have to hurry because he didn't call for immediate action. But following him, you had rather serious abuse of the language by Nixon, and some of his was malicious, and by Jimmy Carter, quite by accident, I think. Jimmy was sort of hooked on adverbs. He would say things like, I avidly remember. And it's hard to do. You'd get you worrying about the adverb, and you wouldn't really pay much attention to the verb or the action. Or you say, I will evolve a foreign policy and consummate it openly and publicly. Well, consummations openly and publicly are, you're sort of stirred to know just what he had in mind. So you forget about what was going to be consummated and begin to worry about it's being done openly and publicly. And this language disregard or attack on it, I think, has been, it's reached sort of the fullest development possible in George Bush. And a few linguists and even lawyers have to be concerned about the stability of language. Should pay careful attention to the language of George Bush. He's into, well, they do strange things. They'll make nouns out of adjectives, or they'll create verbs out of nouns. Or they'll change the meaning of verbs. One or two recent examples. During the Persian Gulf War, he was taking a vacation somewhere. The administration said it wasn't his fault, that Barbara made him do it. So he couldn't even take a vacation on his own determination. But George said he was going to vacate. And you say, well, that could mean a lot of things. Is he, leaving the White House, or is it a physical problem, or how are we supposed to understand this? He was going to vacate. He wanted everybody else to vacate. You say, for some people, that's a serious threat. But vacating, and he said there was some problem. He said, I'm going to let it resolve. How does that happen? He's going to let it resolve. He said, well, I'm going to, it's going to be resolved, or someone's going to do it, but it's going to resolve. And I'm of the opinion that he may be sort of the ideal example of what I try to understand, which is a new school of literary criticism at Yale of deconstructionism. And we may have to look to that not only for language, but also to his approach to the Constitution and to politics in general. But in any case, something that, a whole complex of things are not fully his responsibility. There's been this development of first the personalization of the presidency, the disregard for the Constitution, and then moving from that, because persons don't want to take that much responsibility, to a kind of total depersonalization of the presidency in the denial of the use of the pronoun I. All right? That's it.
Road to the White House continues. Here is a program reminder. Former California Governor Jerry Brown is expected to officially enter the 1990